Hey out there, it's Timothy here. I wanted to do a follow-up video to a video I posted about a month ago. If you've seen it, that video was referencing triple Ixalan as a format, and it was kind of a little bit of a gripe video, but more or less I wanted to discuss some of the problems that triple Ixalan had. And in that video, I came up with a couple ideas of what I wanted to see from rivals of Ixalan that could improve the format. Rivals of Ixalan has been out for about a month now, and I think people are thoroughly enjoying it. So I think it's a pretty good time to stand back and kind of view things through the lens of Triple Ixalan and see if Rivals really delivered on what people wanted from the draft format. So just to kind of recap real quick, the purpose of this video is just to see if Rivals improved Ixalan, if it's better for having the second small set than it was as just a large set. And did it fix those problems that Triple Ixalan had that we mentioned? To recap on those problems, I had three main things that I discussed in the original video. The first thing was that being a hyper-aggressive format, which Rivals is still hyper-aggressive, and there's nothing wrong with having an aggressive format. Being an aggressive format, Triple Ixalan didn't have answers to threats, or it did, but they weren't very efficient answers or very reliable answers. The removal wasn't very heavy, and if your opponent got a pretty big jump start on you or a big lead on you, you often just lost the game, and you lost it quickly too. There just weren't ways to combat some of the really fast starts from things like the red-white aggro deck and other decks along those lines. Another big problem I had with Ixalan that we'll mention here again is the unsupported draft archetypes, specifically the black-green decks and the white-blue decks. They had an archetype. Technically, blue-white was more of a flyers type deck, as it usually is in Limited, and black-green was kind of an explorer deck, but they weren't designed in a way where you got rewarded for drafting them or staying open. It was basically if those were the only colors open and everything else, all of the tribes seemed to get cut, you would shift into those colors one out of every 10 to 20 drafts. But it didn't feel good when you walked away from the draft being in those colors. And Rivals has added a little support there that we'll talk about. And the third big thing that I mentioned in the video that I had an issue with for Triple Ixalan was the rigid drafting. There was very little flexibility in the draft. If you started off with 3 to 4 vampire cards, you were committed to vampires. But then if you found out vampires wasn't open, there was no wiggle room. You were stuck drafting vampires or just abandoning all of your first couple picks. And due to the low playability count, there were a lot of just not very good unplayable cards in Triple Ixalan. You could get shafted pretty hard if you started out in one tribe and then got cut later in the draft. So those are the main issues. The lack of answers to threats, the unsupported color pairs, and the rigid draft structure of Ixalan. And with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about Rivals of Ixalan. So I do want to start out by saying I really enjoyed Rivals of Ixalan. I think it's basically what I wanted out of Ixalan when the set originally came out. We knew the flavor was good. I don't think anybody at all is complaining about the flavor of Ixalan. People love the pirates, they love the dinosaurs, so on and so forth. You know, some people love the merfolk for some reason. But with that being said, the flavor is not an issue. It's the gameplay. And Rivals has improved the gameplay. It plays out a lot like Ixalan, where you're usually trying to get out to an aggressive start. You're usually trying to attack your opponent to death very quickly. But the big thing that they added is removal. There's a lot of removal. There's also a high playability count. If you look through this video that's playing in the background, maybe you're just listening, but if you are actually watching the draft that's happening, most of the cards in all the packs are playable. Some of them aren't as good as others, but even the more vanilla creatures are playable in this set, which is good. There's a lot more decision-making going on in the matches. There's more interaction between you and your opponent. It's not just blocking, hoping your opponent doesn't have a combat trick, and getting blown out and losing pretty much immediately afterwards, which is what Ixalan felt like to me before Rivals came out. So the first problem we had mentioned that there were few answers to threats, which is not a good thing when you're talking about an aggressive format. You need to be able to keep up with aggressive starts. I think for the most part that's fixed. I think Rivals did a good job of providing enough removal in the set to actually take care of some of the aggressive decks. And I'm not saying the aggressive decks are bad now. They're still very good. In fact, you still want to be an aggro player in this format for the most part. It's just that you don't completely lose if you draft with that in mind. If you know that your opponent's going to be off to an aggressive start, then you have ways to combat that now. I think one thing that Rivals did exceptionally well is that they provided removal spells in every single color at the common rarity too. There are some pretty good uncommon and rare removal spells, but we're talking about just commons here. So just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, red has Bombard, which I've marked as the best common in the set. Black has Impale, which everybody knows is good, and Moment of Craven, which is actually sometimes even better than Impale in this format. Water Knot and Crash and Wave in blue help you keep up with your opponents, with Water Knot being actually exceptionally good to some of the bombs that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And green has Hunt a Week, which is just fantastic in the set. Hunt a Week being basically more or less an upgrade to Pounce. Not quite as good as Savage Stomp, but you get the point. It does its job. It provides green with a common way to deal with other threats. And then white has Luminous Bonds, and even looking through the packs going on screen, you can see a lot of these removal spells coming around. If you draft the Open Tribe, you're bound to get some removal spells. Red even has Mutiny, which is not a card I listed, but a card that plays out very well as a removal spell. There are just good ways to deal with creatures, and most of these removal spells are effective at dealing with a lot of the threats in the format. There are very few things you can't kill with some of these formats. Bombard being, in my opinion, the best common in the set, takes care of nearly every single threat, minus some things like Colossal Dreadmaw. It takes them out, and it does it very efficiently at instant speed. It makes it so that if you're not necessarily winning the game right away, you have ways to combat what your opponent's doing, which I think is fantastic. So the fact that Rivals provided answers to threats is already a huge upgrade to the format. It also means that you can build a control deck. You don't necessarily have to be all in aggro. I do think you get rewarded for being aggro if you draft a good aggressive deck, but you can actually build a control deck. There's even this kind of deck building strategy going around with Rivals where people just pick up all of the Sailor of Means or Brazen Freebooters and play this clue-based late game splash deck where they just play a bunch of big bombs and a bunch of big threats, and they look to block on the ground with their 1/4s and 3/3s and stuff like that and take over the late game. So you can do that. You can absolutely build a control deck with the removal spells that are provided. Granted, you have some sort of late game inevitability that can take over the game. You just have to still be careful of those early game starts from the opponents. The aggressive decks are good. They haven't gotten worse. They've definitely gotten better, but there are ways to combat them. The colors are all pretty much even on power level. I know that's kind of an odd statement to throw out there. Obviously, there are going to be some decks that are better than others. I do think there are certain tribes that are better than other tribes when you get a good version of the deck. But overall, there's not an unplayable color. Blue can keep up, a blue-black pirate deck can keep up with a red-white dinosaur deck, and vice versa, given certain situations. I think all of the colors being on about an equal power level means that people aren't necessarily forcing one thing or another. They're just going along with what the packs have, and that's pretty great, right? And another point on the removal that I wanted to mention here is not only is the removal good in the set, but it's good in the context of the set too. If you look at some of the particular removal spells, take a Moment of Craven, the 1 in a black instant, give a creature -2/-2 and gain 2 life. This is just a solid removal spell. You'd play this in pretty much any format, but the 2 life is huge here. 2 life matters so much in an aggressive format, and it helps you keep up with the aggressive deck so much that I can't help but feel like it was intentionally designed for this set to make sure that you could have a tool against these aggressive starts, and it plays out very well like that. Water Knot and Luminous Bonds, the 2 aura-based removal spells in blue and white, they help you take care of some of the other auras in the set that you might end up losing to. Cards like See Red or One with the Wind. These cards that I mentioned in the original video as just taking over games, Mark of the Vampire, stuff like that. There wasn't a lot of risk associated with putting an aura like that on your creature. It would just take over the game 9 times out of 10. But there are a lot of ways to punish your opponent for that, given removal spells that just lock the creature down. It's easy to get a 2-for-1 on your opponent if they try to go for some sort of aura-based combo or something like that. Sure, you still have the starts where you have Jade Guardian or Soul of the Rapids and you get to throw an aura on it, but Soul of the Rapids isn't in anybody's list of most impressive creatures, right? There are more interactions going on here. There are more ways to deal with the kind of 2-card monstrosities your opponents can put together, and it does very well in the format. Another example, Hunt the Weak is just a good card. We see Hunt the Weak in sets quite often nowadays. I want to say it was in Kaladesh or Ether Revolt. It's in core sets pretty often. It was in some other set recently that's not really coming to mind, maybe Amonkhet. But Hunt the Weak gets printed a lot, and me and my friends have discussed that Hunt the Weak is at its best in this format than it's ever been in any other format because of Enrage. A fight spell is very good, and that's not like blowing anybody's mind. We already knew fight spells worked well with Enrage, but Hunt the Weak being a perfect removal spell for a green deck, especially for these decks that want to trigger their Enrage creatures, I think the design is just intentional, and I think it's really good. So overall, there are lots of little aggressive creatures in this format. They're hard to block. There are things like Gilt Grove, Stalker, the merfolk that can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. There's Kite Sail Corsair, the 2-1 that has flying when it's attacking the pirate. Goblin Trailblazer, 2-1 Menace. These are all commons I'm talking about. Lots of really aggressive 1 and 2 drop creatures that just get in tons and tons of damage. If they were in Ixalan, they would just account for half of your opponent's life total nearly every single game. There wouldn't be a lot of ways to deal with them. And being on the play is such a bump in a format like that sometimes you're on the draw and you just lose to being on the draw, which doesn't feel good. But for the most part, I think that if you understand the format is aggressive, that there are still going to be these really fast starts, and you prioritize removal for that reason, you should be able to walk away from most drafts feeling like you're not just going to fall behind if you lose the die roll. You should be able to keep up with what your opponent's doing most of the time. There are going to be some aggro starts that completely destroy you, some tempo-based aggro starts, but for the most part, you can get around them. The second problem I had mentioned in Triple Ixalan were the unsupported color types. I've already mentioned these. That's black-green, which I guess was supposed to be an Explorer archetype originally, and blue-white, which was basically a Favored Winds deck. It was a Flyers deck, but didn't really come together that often. It was basically just blue-white tempo or black-green stuff. There wasn't a lot of reason to go into these, and if you ended up in those colors, you weren't really happy with your draft. I think I've heard a lot, some mixed opinions about this from a lot of different people. I think this is still a problem in Rivals of Ixalan. I think Rivals did a good job of fixing a lot of Ixalan's problems, but I don't think they particularly did a good job of fixing this. And it might just be that with Ixalan being designed the way it was, this is just a problem from the start that's going to persist through the entire block regardless. What I'm saying here is, I think you're still going to be better off for just drafting a tribal deck. It is nice that if your draft's not going very well and you're just picking up black and green cards, that there is a tiny amount of payoff for it. But overall, your tribal decks are still going to be significantly better and more synergistic than your random blue-white decks and your random black-green decks. And you can tell they threw out some gold uncommons this time around, and even a couple rares in those color combinations to kind of say, hey, look, you can draft these. This is a draftable archetype. If you take these cards, you'll get rewarded. If other people aren't in the colors, you might get rewarded. You might get past them. We're talking about the two uncommons, Jungle Creeper and Resplendent Griffin. My problem is that neither of these cards feel like huge payoffs to me. If I'm blue-white, I'm absolutely playing the Griffin. If I'm black-green, I'm happy playing Jungle Creeper. But they're not really huge payoffs. They're not the type of gold cards where I say, ooh, wow, I want to first pick that and maybe draft around the colors. Not that you should be first picking gold cards in the first place. And if I'm black-green and I get past a late Jungle Creeper, I don't even feel like Jungle Creeper's that good of a card. It's just a solid body with late-game ability, but it's not the type of card that you're super stoked to open or anything along those lines. There are a couple rares, too. I think Azor, the blue-white Sphinx, is one of the only reasons I would end up in blue-white in the first place. It is absolutely a bomb, but the mana requirements are so heavy that you basically have to be blue-white when you open it. And then there is, for black-green, there's Journey to Eternity. This is the enchantment that when the enchanted creature dies, it transforms into a land that can start reanimating creatures. Really awesome card, but really finicky and hard to get going, right? You have to have your own creature die somehow, and it's really easy for your opponent to play around that. So oftentimes you have to set it up so you're using removal on your own creature. Really finicky kind of card with high upside, but again, not enough that I'm willing to draft an archetype that doesn't really play as well as some of the other tribal archetypes in this format. So overall, I think they did a little bit of work to try and get you to draft these two colored archetypes some amount of the time, but I think their focus is still on the tribes. And obviously, being a tribal set, you want to have those tribal rewards. You want to be in black, white vampires, blue, green merfolk, something along those lines. You don't necessarily want to go into a draft at a big tournament or something and end up in one of these lesser archetypes. And I do think they are worse than the main tribal archetypes. In fact, I think all 8 of the tribal archetypes, blue, black pirates, red, black pirates, white, black vampires, so on and so forth, I think every single one of them is better than either of these flyer decks or these just value black, green decks. So I don't think Rivals did a fantastic job at fixing this per se, but I also think it was just an inherent problem with the way that things were set up. Having 2 3-color archetypes and 2 2-color archetypes really led things to a point where the color pairs that got left out didn't really keep up with the rest of the format. It is nice that they added something, but it feels like Jungle Creeper is just a bonus if you get stuck in a poor archetype rather than a card you want to be taken and drafted around, right? I don't think anybody's like super stoked to have Jungle Creepers in their deck. I'm certainly not. But one more point before we move on to the last problem is the mana fixin's good here, which does help when it comes to these archetypes that are hard to draft. The mana fixin's really good. Evolving Wilds is huge. Traveler's Amulet is huge. These sort of cards in a limited format really help you to be able to move around when it comes to the draft, which we'll talk about in a moment. But you've also got things like the uncommon dual lands. Not entirely sure why they're in the set and not sure why they're uncommon, but these are the cards like Foul Orchard, Forsaken Sanctuary, so on and so forth, Highland Lake, cards that just help you fix mana, and having them around is a nice addition to the set. It helps you maneuver the draft a little bit differently than you might otherwise. It helps you have a little bit of flexibility, and then you've got your random splash cards like Thunderherd Migration, so on and so forth. Just things that give you a little bit more wiggle room in the format when it comes to drafting maybe a multicolored deck. And of course, the treasure token deck is still alive. It's still a thing you can do. I'm not entirely sure if it plays out as well as just sticking to a 2-color pair, but it is intriguing. There is the Sailor of Means deck, which a lot of people have been talking about lately. Anyway, the third point here, and final point, before I talk about some of the other issues that I'm having with Rivals, and they're not big. Like I said, I like Rivals, but there's still things to talk about. The rigid draft structure of Ixalan, I just kind of touched on this a little bit. It seems like in Rivals, there's just a higher chance of getting paid off. There are more payoffs in general. There are more tribal cards. There are more cards that care about a specific tribe. And that means that you can support multiple drafters in the same archetype. I've often drafted some of the channels on my video, or some of the videos on my channel, rather, and it feels like, maybe I'm fighting somebody for vampires, but there's still a pretty high playable count for vampires that I end up getting a decent deck overall. I'm not scrapping, I'm not putting bad cards in my deck just to fill out a curve or something like that. I actually get enough playables, and oftentimes I end up with around 30 playables, and I have to end up cutting 6 or 7 from my deck, which feels good. It feels like you're drafting quite well, or the draft format is set up quite well if you walk away with 30 playables a good majority of the time. It just means that, there's a lot of playables in the packs, whereas Ixalan had a lot of dead weight in the packs, and it feels good to have a shift towards just more playable commons and uncommons overall. And the way this draft format plays out is, I feel like the last pack, the actual Ixalan pack, it rewards you now. If you stick to an open tribe, if you find an open tribe and you really force it or you stick to it, then you get a lot of payoffs in the last pack. When you're playing vampires, you get called to the feasts in the last pack. When you're playing pirates, you seem to get Pirates Cutlass pretty late, March of the Drowned, stuff like that. This was always the case for Triple Ixalan, but it seems very apparent in Rivals that your goal should be to find the open tribe. Not necessarily force your first couple picks or force a tribe, but find the open tribe and stick to it so that you can get past all the good stuff in the last pack. And there is a lot to say for, cards sticking to their own tribe. The pirate cards are really good in pirates, but they take a knockdown if you play them in a non-pirate deck, which means when you get to that last pack, people are going to prioritize the cards that synergize with their own decks, and they're often going to leave alone the cards that don't play well in their decks, which means if you're taking the tribal support for the tribe that you're in, other people aren't necessarily going to be as interested in it, which is really nice. It does feel like you're getting paid off in that last pack, unless you're blue-white or black-green. Then you just basically get a bunch of nothing. And finally, before we talk about some of the new problems, I would like to say there are expensive cards in Rivals of Ixalan. Expensive meaning high mana cost, not monetary value. There are, 6, 7, 8, even a 9-drop in the set that are highly playable cards. They are game-winning, game-breaking cards, and they're playable, and that's a good thing, but there are also answers to them, right? And I think a lot of people noticed in Ixalan, the format was just too aggressive for you to actually be able to play a 7 or 8 drop most of the time. You could maybe get away with 1 or 2 of them, but you couldn't reliably cast it. A lot of the time, games ended around turn 6 or 7, and your big 7 mana creature just didn't have time to sit on the board or even make it out onto the board and have an impact, whereas Rivals gives you the opportunity and the gameplay experience to be able to play 6, 7, 8 drop creatures if you draft your deck around it, and if you have a plan for the early game, which I think is a nice little touch. You open something like Zatalpa and you really want to play it, or Zakama and you really want to play it. Well, you can draft your deck to do that. You can play cards like Knight of the Stampede, which plays defense really well at the same time working towards your game plan. I think the design of the set encourages that. Now, with that being said, before we go ahead and go here, I do want to mention some of the things that are coming to mind as problems that Rivals of Ixalan still has. Just to be fair, I think Rivals fixed a lot of the issues with Ixalan, but we have to be fair and mention some of the problems they still have. And the first thing I think most people are going to remember when we revisit Ixalan in any capacity are the bombs in the set, right? This is the one thing that comes to mind when people ask how the set is. The bombs are just insane. There are tons of cards that just come to mind when I think of limited bombs here. Cards like Tetsamok, the Primal Death, I think it's called, the Black Elder Dino, the Immortal Sun, Tendershoot Dryads, Rekindle and Phoenix, Profane Procession, Hadana's Climb. Like, I'm just naming these off the top of my head. These are enchantments, creatures that just completely turn the tide of the game in your favor, which plays double. First off, it means that if you're getting beat down, if you're really far behind, a lot of these cards can turn the game back in your favor, which is nice, sure, but in just an average fair game, some of these cards' power level is through the roof, almost unbeatable. And while it's kind of annoying sometimes that your good deck is just going to lose to a bomb, I do think it's worth revisiting that point that there is very good removal in the set. There isn't a single one of these bombs that you can't answer in some capacity. If you watched my most recent video on the channel, I played against Tetsamok in the final rounds of the game. I think a lot of people agree that Tetsamok is one of the best cards in the set, if not the best card, and it's almost unbeatable. Almost every time your opponent plays it or shows it to you, you feel like you're going to lose the game. But I beat it by just boarding in a hand disruption card, waiting for my opponent to show it to me, and then stripping it out of their hand. And you can do stuff like that to most of these bombs. There are cards like the Immortal Sun. Well, Shatter is in the set. Shatter's not a great card, but it is an answer, right? Things like Tendershoot Dryad and Profane Procession, Hadana's Climb. There's enchantment removal. You can play Cleanse and Ray. You can play Demystify. You can play Naturalize, stuff like that. You can play removal spells for some of the really problematic creatures. Nothing is going to go so unanswered that you just can't deal with it, that there aren't answers for it. But it does feel kind of annoying when some of these bombs hit the battlefield in just an average game because they do warp the game around themselves in such a ridiculous manner. It's pretty absurd sometimes. The other thing I wanted to mention, and this isn't really a huge gripe, in fact, it's not really a bad thing at all, is just the Ascend mechanic overall. Just didn't feel very exciting. I like most of the mechanics from Ixalan. A lot of them were returning mechanics like vehicles and raid. I like Enrage, so on and so forth, stuff like that. But Ascend, I just don't think it really hit the mark. I would like to see more of it, and I think my big problem with Ascend is that it just didn't feel very exciting. It didn't feel like the payoffs were something to really actively work towards. Cards like Spirewinder, where they just get bumped +1/+1, they didn't feel particularly great. And I'm not saying Ascend's a bad mechanic. I'm just saying the actual cards that were designed with Ascend didn't feel like I wanted to build an Ascend deck. It felt like an afterthought. It didn't feel like a fully fleshed out mechanic, which kind of sucks. I would like to see more of it in the future and see what they can do with it. And I think one thing that really would have added some tension to the mechanic is if they had designed it so that you lose the city's blessing when you go below 10 permanents, there could have been some opportunities for risk and reward and so on and so forth. I think it shouldn't have been for the rest of the game. It almost trivializes the remainder of the game and the rest of your Ascend cards if once you Ascend, you don't have to worry about it for the rest of the game. I think it should have been something that's kind of like an on-off switch. If you have 10 permanents, it's on. If you go below 10 permanents, you lose it or something along those lines so that your opponent has kind of a way to interact with the city's blessing. And I mean, flavorfully, you can lose the city's blessing, right? That's a thing that happens in the story. And I think it would have been nice to see that mechanic kind of play into that theme. But that's not a huge gripe. It's just something I wish we had seen a little bit more of. Cards like Wayward Swordtooth, I think, are really cool designs for Ascend. Something that starts off with a really high ceiling, but doesn't quite work well until you get the city's blessing. And then there are the cards that play out decently and then get significantly better once you have the city's blessing. I would have just liked to see more design space. Which, final point before I go, is I like what they did with Explore. There were only a handful of cards that actually had Explore in Rivals of Ixalan, and it kind of sucked because they did some really cool designs with it. They did Jadelight Ranger, the double Explorer creature that's just like rampant in Standard right now, and Path of Discovery. Every time a creature comes in, you explore. These are cool designs. This is what I wanted to see with Explore, not just a random creature that comes down and explores, and another slightly different power toughness ratio creature that comes down and explores, or a creature that has flying and explores. None of them felt particularly different. They all played a little bit different, but I think more design space for Explore would have been nice. And it is a mechanic that I hope comes back in maybe a core set or another set or something along those lines, because I'd like to see where the design space takes these mechanics. But at any rate, those are the things I wanted to mention for this format. I do want to reiterate that I really like Rivals of Ixalan. I think the interactions are really fun. I think the games play out well, and minus a couple scenarios where you just get crushed by certain bombs, I think it's a good format. I think when people look back at this format 5-10 years from now and people start doing maybe flashback drafts, I think we're going to do Rivals of Ixalan drafts rather than triple Ixalan drafts. And I think that's what people are going to remember most, is Rivals being a good format, triple Ixalan being a problematic format. So, as with my previous video, I'd love to hear what some of your opinions are on this format, especially if you're enjoying it, or maybe even if you are not enjoying the format. Let me know in the comments below. Tell me what it is that you like about the format or what you don't like. If you agree with what I'm saying or disagree with anything, let me know. We can talk about it, right? And I hope to keep doing videos like this for some of the upcoming formats, because I do think it's worth talking about whether we have good or bad formats, or what formats can do to fix themselves, or what players can do to fix formats, and so on and so forth. And I hope you enjoy this format and for these videos, whether you're watching the draft going on in the background or just listening in audio form. But at any rate, I appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to listen. My name's Timothy with Mana Rocks. Stick to the channel, like, comment, subscribe, let people know. And I'll be back next time. I'll have another draft video up this Friday. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll see y'all